Now, as Naeem alluded to, this is part of a series of work that has been exploring the relationship between demand charges and behind-the-meter PV. The prior studies, the two previous studies, focused on only PV, no storage, for the residential and commercial sectors, respectively. And you can find webinars as well as briefings on those topics online in the same location as where you'll find the briefing that underlies the webinar that I'll be talking about today. Now, our motivation for looking at this particular topic is the ubiquity of demand charges in the commercial sector. We estimate that about 25% of the revenue that utility companies in the U.S. collect from commercial and industrial sector comes from demand charges. And now, given the fact that we compensate distributed energy resources essentially through retail electricity tariffs, it is important to understand the relationship of these technologies and the structure of the retail electricity tariffs. Now, these previous studies that we referenced, the ones that looked at just PV, found that PV alone is somewhat limited in its ability to reduce demand charges due to poor coincidence between PV generation and the load profiles of the host buildings, as well as things like intermittent dips in PV generation that will reduce demand charge savings for a given month. These are both things that is reasonable to hypothesize that storage can help to mitigate these problems, which is why we decided to investigate the co-deployment of solar plus storage, with a particular emphasis on whether or not there are synergies in co-deploying the two technologies. So with that context, I'll now move on and talk a little bit about the methodological details of the analysis, as well as some of the major assumptions that are important for interpreting the results. This is given in more detail in the briefing online, but I'll give you the main points here. So the workflow that we used in this analysis is illustrated with this graphic on the left. And what you can see here is that we started off with a data set, weather data for 15 different locations across the United States that vary to cover the different climate zones in the U.S. And then using that weather data, which was historical weather data for 17 years, we generated two different profiles. One of them is using the Energy Plus simulation software. We generated sets of load profiles for representative commercial buildings. And then also using that same weather data, we used the system advisor model to generate the PV generation profiles for hypothetical PV systems at those locations under those conditions. Then for simulations where there was PV generation being considered, we would take the load profile, net out the PV generation profile, and then hand that to a storage dispatcher, which would then optimize the dispatch of a storage asset, if there was one, to determine the final billing demand of the host building, the building that was hosting the solar plus storage system. That final load profile, which is net of PV and the storage charging and discharging, would then be passed to a demand charge calculator, which would simply report out the final billing demand of the host building, which would then be compared to the billing demand without the system, which is the main thing that we will be reporting and talking about today, the ability of the systems to reduce demand charges. Now, as I hinted at there, we have explored the trends across 15 different cities and 15 different representative commercial buildings within each of those cities, using the Department of Energy's commercial reference buildings to generate these representative customer types. We also explore a range of system sizes. Now, these numbers are kind of abstract if you're not already familiar with them, but the PV generation we talk about its size in terms of the percentage of the host building's annual energy consumption that it is providing. And the battery systems, we will talk about their size as a percentage of the host building's lifetime peak demand. Again, that's kind of abstract, so just generally you can think about it as 10% being a relatively small system, not teeny, but small, and a system that is sized nominally 100% for both of these metrics is quite a large system. That's quite a bit larger than most buildings. Most commercial buildings are currently deploying their systems here. So that's just kind of intuitive feel for it if these numbers are a little bit too abstract. Moving forward, there is one tile there that deserves a little bit more description, which is the storage dispatch. The key things that are happening here that should be clarified is that we are dispatching the storage asset assuming perfect foresight, and the dispatch is optimized to only focus on reducing the building's billing demand. We aren't looking at things like on-peak, off-peak energy arbitrage or participation in ancillary service markets or any of these other things that the batteries could conceivably be used for. This is just exclusively looking at billing demand reduction. On the left here, we see an example of what our battery dispatcher would produce for a given example situation. This is a hotel that we selected just as an illustration. You can see that the original load profile of the hotel peaked in the morning and in the evening. That's the blue line. And when we added the battery system, it did a small amount of peak shaving in the morning, charged up slightly, or charged up to be full during the course of the day when the hotel's electricity demand was relatively low, and then discharged fully to achieve the maximum possible peak reduction in the evening when the building was peaking. Now, two other assumptions that I am going to mention but are of lesser importance is that we modeled the battery as having 83% round-trip efficiency, and the ratio of battery capacity in kilowatt hours to the power of the battery was 3 times, meaning that you could discharge the battery at full power for 3 hours or at half power for 6 hours, etc. These assumptions are definitely important for the financial performance of a storage system. However, all of the results that we are going to be reporting today, the general trends of the relationship between demand charges and solar plus storage systems, are not strongly influenced by these technical parameters. We did explore a range of them, and it wasn't the results we'll be discussing today are not significantly influenced by them. So we don't, for simplicity, we just hold these constant throughout the analysis that we'll be showing today. Now, we will be looking at several different types of demand charges. The most common one that we'll spend the most time looking at is what we call the basic non-coincident demand charge. That is simply a demand charge that is assessed based on the customer's maximum demand, not instantaneous maximum demand, but rather the maximum of a rolling averaged window that we will use a default average window of 60 minutes, but at any time throughout the month. There is no, it could be in the morning, it could be in the evening, whenever the building peaks, that's when the demand charge, the billing demand is assessed. We will also look at peak period demand charges, where we restrict the time that the billing demand is calculated to some window in the day. So whatever the building's peak demand is from noon to 5 p.m., for example. Additionally, we will look at the impact of changing the averaging interval for assessing what the building's maximum demand is. So that's where up here we are using a 60-minute averaging interval as a default, but we will look at the impact of averaging the building's energy consumption over 30-minute, 1 hour, 2 hour, and 4 hour averaging intervals. Now, I've said this a couple times already, but just to be clear, we will be reporting the results in terms of a percentage reduction in billing demand. That is simply the reduction when in kilowatts when you have the solar plus storage system, or a solar only or storage only system when appropriate, divided by the original demand without the solar plus storage asset. We say billing demand because depending on some details like tiers, the billing demand does not necessarily map directly to demand charge savings. However, in most cases it does. So if you're not familiar with what billing demand is, you can just think about this as a percentage reduction in the monthly demand charges of the host building, and that is in most cases equivalent. Now, one last slide in this method section. There are some limitations and some boundaries to this analysis that warrant being explicit about. The first one is that throughout this entire briefing, we are only going to be talking about things from the customer perspective. This is talking about the customer's ability to achieve demand charge savings by reducing their billing demand and therefore reducing their monthly demand charges. We are not making any attempt here to characterize the value of these behind-the-meter solar plus storage systems to the bulk power system, which is of primary interest to the other ratepayers that are not adopters of this system. So when we, for instance, report that there is or is not a synergy in co-deployment of the technologies, we are not making a statement about whether or not there's a synergy in the services that they are providing to the grid, only the benefits from the perspective of the host of the system. Additionally, as I hinted at before, we do assume perfect foresight for the storage dispatcher. That is, of course, an idealization, and it is something that we will be in time asymptotically approaching as our forecasting and dispatching algorithms improve. But you should consider these things, the storage results, to be upper limits on the performance of storage assets if they had perfect foresight. Lastly, the load profiles that we use reflect weather-related variability. We use that 17 years of historical weather data to generate the load profiles. However, we do not reflect other sources of variability, such as whether or not the host building changes how it's being used over the course of the system being owned or something like that. We assume those kind of things stay constant over the lifetime of the system. With that being said, thank you for hanging with me for the methods bit. Now we get to talk a little bit about the results. So the first thing I'm going to show you is the distribution of the reduction in billing demand for the solar-only systems, the storage-only systems, and the co-deployed solar plus storage systems. Now what we're showing here, these plots, these histograms, are for all the different locations and all of the different building types and all of the different system sizes. So this is in that original slide that I showed what we were simulating. This is the distribution of all the different simulations we ran. Now, as we have seen in previous studies, the solar PV alone has what I would describe as relatively limited ability to reduce demand charges. The median value for the entire range that we were looking at was an 8% average monthly billing demand reduction for solar PV only systems. This includes some of those very large systems that get up to 100% of the host building's annual energy consumption. Those can get out here when they're hosted on the right building, they can get up to over 30% billing demand reduction. But again, these are very large systems that are having relatively modest declines in billing demand reduction. This we've seen before. These other two plots are what are new. This middle plot right here is the distribution of billing demand reduction for storage-only systems. And what you can see here is, first of all, there are no systems here that achieve no billing demand reduction. the storage system is always able to achieve at least some reduction in the building demand, unlike PV, where there are some situations where it just didn't do anything at all. Also, the range is wider and the median value is higher. The median value for this wide range of systems we're analyzing was 23% average building demand reduction. However, it also does have something of an upper limit of somewhere around 40%, even though the storage systems are very large. Some of the storage systems are very large, going up to 100% of the host building's peak demand. Now, lastly, then we look here at the technologies when they're co-deployed, and you can see here that the building demand that they are able to achieve is significantly greater, exceeding 70% building demand reduction in some situations. Looking at the median value, you can see that the median reduction for this range of systems that we looked at was 42%. And this really kind of hints at what we're going to dive into now, which is that if you just simply look at the medians, you can kind of intuitively guess that there is some type of synergy going on here, because the median reduction for the co-deployed systems is greater than the sum of the reduction of either technology acting alone. Now, that's really kind of what we want to dive into, but first we need a way to think about whether or not there is any synergy and a way to define that quantitatively. So for that, I'm going to introduce a metric. We call it the cooperation ratio, and this is a measure, a metric to express the degree of synergy in co-deploying solar behind-the-meter solar plus storage systems in their ability to reduce the host building's building demand. Now, the cooperation ratio we're defining as the building demand reduction for the co-deployed system plus divided by the building demand reduction of the solar alone system plus the building demand reduction for the storage alone system. So it's the reduction of the combined systems divided by the sum of their individual parts if they were deployed alone. So to give some examples here, I have some hypothetical buildings, just dummy data to illustrate the calculation. For this building X here, we're saying if solar alone can achieve 20 kilowatts of reduction, storage alone can also achieve 20 kilowatts of reduction, but when you co-deploy them, they're able to together achieve 40 kilowatts of building demand reduction, then we say the cooperation ratio is 1. The co-deployed system is able to achieve the same thing as the two parts if they were operating independently. So you can think of this as essentially there's no synergy in co-deployment. There's no extra value that they're finding by co-deploying. Now that is in contrast to building Y, this second row here, where we are giving an example where the solar alone reduction is 10 kilowatts, the storage alone reduction is 10 kilowatts, but combined they're able to achieve 30 kilowatts of building demand reduction. Therefore, there is synergy here. The cooperation is 1.5 because 10 plus 10 is 20, and the co-deployed system is 30, so 30 divided by 20 is 1.5. So this is the metric that we're going to be using to express the existence of synergy when co-deploying these technologies. Now that's the metric, and this plot right here shows the lifetime average cooperation ratio for all the 15 different building types we looked at and the 15 different locations we looked at. So what's being plotted here is the cooperation ratio for solar plus storage systems on these buildings and in these locations. The sizes of the system, the PV system is sized to be 20% of the building, provide 20% of the building's annual energy consumption, and the storage system is sized to be 20% of the building's lifetime peak. Again, these are moderately sized systems, but they're not huge. It's a reasonable estimate if you just had to pick a default value for commercial systems. Now what we can see here is that the cooperation ratio, the lifetime average cooperation ratio ranges from about 1, which means there really isn't any synergy, all the way up to more than 1.8. Now the first thing is the fact that we don't see values here less than 1. There are other values in different simulations that we have where in some instances we do see values less than 1, which means that the technologies are actually working against each other when co-deployed. Now, this is important because it definitely was not, it's not intuitively obvious, or at least it wasn't to me, going into this analysis, whether or not this would be true, whether or not there would be synergies, or whether or not these technologies would be kind of taking advantage of trying to compete against each other for like the best demand reduction opportunities and actually work against each other when co-deployed. So like that right there is an important finding, is that in general we see a lot of buildings that are kind of on the low end, that there really isn't any synergy and there isn't significant synergy in co-deployment, but they aren't competing against each other. And then we see a lot of buildings where there is synergies. Now, we can see building types that seem to be consistently have consistently greater synergies, as well as locations that have consistently greater synergies. The building types are buildings that tend to have kind of wide, flat peaks that extend outside of daylight hours, the hospital and large office and the simulations we ran. And the locations that perform the best are ones with good solar resource, but intermittent cloud cover, which was Miami in the particular example that we're giving. So this is the showing you the degree of synergy, but I do want to take a moment to explain mechanically how this is happening. And we have essentially two mechanisms that we've identified that give rise to synergies in co-deployment of solar plus storage. So the first one, this is the more significant of the two, is that solar can create narrow peaks in the morning and evening that then storage is able to more easily clip than the original load profile. So if we start at the top and walk down, we can see that when you have solar alone on this toy example that we mocked up here, you can see that the original load profile, which is this dark black line here, solar is able to take a pretty decent chunk out of the middle of it. However, because the load profile extends into the kind of the twilight hours where the solar generation is not so strong, the ultimate ability of solar to reduce the demand charges is somewhat limited. Now, storage alone has a different type of problem, which is that this peak is flat and quite wide, which means that the storage asset has to shift a lot of energy, a lot of kilowatt hours, to achieve a relatively small kilowatt billing demand reduction. So this is not the best situation for a storage-only asset which likes narrow peaks. Then, when you combine them, of course, you get this synergy. You get the fact that the solar system created these thinner, these tall, thin morning and evening peaks, which then storage is able to come along and clip quite easily, with the final result being that the technologies are able to together achieve greater reduction than the sum of their parts. So that's the first synergy. The second one is that storage can buffer transient dips in solar production from things like cloud passing overhead or something like that. So again, starting at the top, we can see here in this example that we gave, where we just we're showing solar production stop for an hour during the middle of the day. Again, imagine a cloud passing overhead or something of that nature. Solar here is actually not able to reduce the demand charge at all because of this event. Now, storage is acting the same in this situation. It doesn't care about the cloud. But when you combine them together, the storage system is able to patch that dip in solar production for a result that is greater than the sum of the two technologies acting alone. So those are two mechanisms by which synergies are achieved. I do want to have one last thing I say about the cooperation ratio before we move on, which is just to kind of be as clear as possible about this. It is a measure of synergy, not of absolute performance of the solar plus storage system. So I'm going to go back to this example that I gave before when I was first illustrating the calculation of the cooperation ratio metric. what you can see here, and you may have noticed this when I was originally describing it, is that the building that has a cooperation ratio of 1, meaning there was no synergy, had a billing demand reduction of 40 kilowatts, whereas the building that had the existence of some synergies actually saw less billing demand reduction. Obviously, this is just a toy example that I put together for the sake of illustrating the point, but this does happen in the simulations that we're exploring, that essentially you can have synergies in co-deploying if the original technologies just performed poorly with that system. There can be essentially incremental value in co-deploying them. However, it doesn't necessarily mean that that is the host building that is going to see the greatest absolute reduction in billing demand. What that means that if both of these buildings are on the same demand charge rate, the same dollar per kilowatt value in reducing billing demand, even though building X does not have any synergy, it would see greater absolute monthly billing savings. However, this building, it would make sense to consider adding, for example, a storage system if you already had a solar system. The incremental value of co-deploying in that situation might make that investment a good idea. Additionally, I just want to remind everyone that this is a metric from the customer perspective and has nothing to do, we are not assessing in any way the value to the bulk power system. A high synergy here just means it's an artifact of the fact that we're compensating these technologies through retail electricity tariffs. It's not high synergy, doesn't necessarily mean it has greater value to the bulk power system. Okay, so now we're going to stop talking about the cooperation ratio for a little bit, and we're just going to talk about some other interesting trends in just the raw billing demand reduction for the technologies. Now, this is one where we've seen this trend with solar alone before. This is a well-known thing, which is essentially that there are diminishing returns in the ability of solar to reduce billing demand as the size increases. You can see here, for example, in the primary school, the incremental ability to reduce billing demand decreases as the PV system gets larger. That's because even though the original load may have peaked during the daylight hours, as you put more and more PV on there, the hour at which the demand is peaking gets later and later or earlier in the morning, where the solar system is less effective, less productive. So therefore, incremental decreases in billing demand reduction go down. Again, this is pretty well known, this diminishing return. Storage and the co-deployed systems less so. So these are the more of the new things that we're showing here. And what you can see for batteries is a similar trend where you do have some diminishing returns as batteries get larger for some host building types. Some of them you don't. Some of them it's relatively linear and there isn't really strongly diminishing returns as the system sizes increase. So I would say that the storage alone systems also have diminishing returns, but significantly less strong, significantly weaker than solar alone systems. And then somewhat intuitively, when you combine them, I guess the severity of the diminishing returns is somewhere between the two technologies, between the two individual technologies. There is diminishing returns as systems get larger. However, it's not as strong as the solar alone systems. Now, moving on, these last 3 slides that I'm going to be showing are going to be looking at different types of demand charges. Now, thus far, I have only been showing results for the basic, we call it basic non-coincident demand charge, so that is being assessed at any point throughout the day. But what we're going to look at right here is peak period demand charge designs where the demand charge is, the billing demand is being assessed within a restricted window of time. So we have afternoon peak from noon to 5 p.m. We have a transition peak, transition from daylight to evening, from noon to 10 p.m. And then we have an evening peak that starts at 5 p.m. and goes to 10 p.m. So first we'll look at solar alone. Now this again has been studied elsewhere, but we're showing it here for reference. You can see that the change from going to an afternoon time of use peak period from a basic demand charge is beneficial for PV alone, because PV is most productive in the daylight hours. It is intuitive as to why this would be, you'd be able to achieve greater demand charge savings if your billing demand is being assessed during daylight hours. The transition peak, because it does have that evening component in it, but also the daylight component, is very similar to the basic demand charge. It's kind of the buildings are peaking when they would anyway in very similar ways between these two demand charge designs. And then lastly, the evening peak, intuitively for solar, is significantly worse than the basic demand charge because there isn't much solar generation during these times of day. So you end up with a lot less savings. Now, that's solar. That was pretty well understood. Again, storage and co-deployment is what's new here. And what you can see, looking at the storage-only billing demand reduction under the basic demand charge, for all of the peak periods that we looked at, the median billing demand reduction was greater when the when there was a peak period defined compared to the basic demand charge. And that is largely a product of the fact that if you restrict the time of day that the billing demand is being calculated, then your storage asset will likely have to shift less electricity to achieve the same kilowatt reduction. There's just, you're going to lop off part of that that peak that it probably was going to have to shift under the basic demand charge. So just in general, these time of use periods perform better than the basic demand charge. And the same trend when you co-deploy them. Basically, the storage system is kind of able to overcome the weight of the evening peak that it has on the PV system. And generally, solar plus storage systems perform better than under time of use peak periods than the basic demand charges. Now, those plots, the box and whiskers that I was showing you, were contained all of the different buildings and all the different locations that we analyzed. However, here I break it apart by building type just to illustrate that there are differences between different building types in the essentially value of going from a basic demand charge to a time of use demand charge. Some buildings, the increase is relatively small. Some of them see significant increases in the billing demand reduction when you restrict the time that the billing demand is being calculated. I'm not going to go into this in detail here, but it's discussed more in the full briefing online. Now, the last result that I'm going to show you is for looking at the impact of the averaging interval of the way that the billing demand is being calculated. So again, just as a reminder, billing demand is not typically assessed instantaneously, but rather the power demand of the host building is being averaged over some rolling window of time, and it's the maximum of this rolling average that is taken as the calculated billing demand that then you are charged based off of. This commonly is 15, 30, or 60 minutes, although here we explore values going up to 4 hours just to kind of illustrate the trends going on. So real quickly, solar, again, this has been shown elsewhere, but the longer the averaging interval, the greater the billing demand reduction for solar only. That's because the averaging interval is smoothing out things like dips in production from the solar system. So it is more beneficial to have a longer averaging interval for solar only. For storage, we actually see the opposite, which the longer the averaging interval, the worse the storage system is performing in terms of the percentage of billing demand reduction. That is because the averaging interval is essentially playing a similar function to what the storage system would normally be doing. It's kind of smoothing out the load profile. It's flattening out the thin, narrow peaks and filling in the dips. So essentially, it's preemptively taking away the opportunities that a storage system would have to reduce the host building's billing demand the longer the averaging interval is. And then this is particularly strong when you combine the two technologies together, in the sense that the shorter the averaging interval, the greater the reduction in billing demand for co-deployed systems. Again, that's simply just because the averaging interval is essentially eliminating the opportunities that the storage system would be taking advantage of to achieve its savings. The shorter the averaging interval, the greater opportunity that the storage system has to achieve some demand charge savings. Then we also show the results for one of the peak period systems. I'm not going to go into this in detail. Broadly, we see the same trend. Solar systems benefit from longer averaging intervals. Storage systems slightly decrease, and combined technologies strongly decrease as the averaging intervals get longer. So that is all the results I'm going to cover here. There are additional results in the briefing online, so I'd encourage you to go look at that, as well as some more discussion about the things we have been looking at today. So just very briefly to recap the main points, if there's anything you're going to take away from this, first of all, is that we did find consistent synergies for co-deploying solar and storage behind the meter for commercial customers with demand charges. There was not a lot of competition against each other, essentially. Again, just to emphasize this important point, this does not mean that we observed synergies in the value that they deliver to the bulk power system, only that from the customer's perspective, under this particular way that we compensate the systems through retail electricity tariffs, we see synergies from the customer perspective for co-deploying. Then, additionally, we saw a great deal of variation in savings from the solar plus storage systems between customers and locations. So it's simply, there is no simple one answer as to whether or not, like what the savings you can achieve for putting a solar plus storage system on a commercial entity. To properly assess whether or not the host building is a suitable one would need analysis of the load profile of the host building and the resource, the solar resource that's available to it. Then lastly, we did see some significant variation in the savings that are achieved as a function of the demand charge. So simply, this is worth paying attention to, and worth paying attention to what type of tariff you are on if you're assessing the savings of a solar plus behind the meter, solar plus storage system. So with that being said, I'm done. So Naeem, I'll hand it over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Peter. Again, to remind you all, you can ask questions. A number of you already have been in the chat box on the lower left. Just one question that came up a bunch of times, and I just sent you the information where you can download the slides for this briefing in a slightly more detailed form on our website. And I've also sent you a link to our YouTube channel where this webinar will be uploaded, as well as other webinars from the Electricity Markets and Policy Group of Berkeley Lab. So with that, there have been a number of questions, two questions, asking about 15-minute intervals. So if we were to assume that the averaging intervals were 15 minutes and not 30, which is our base case here, how would you expect the results to change?
Yeah, so unfortunately the weather data that we used to generate both the simulated load profiles and the PV generation profiles only came in 30-minute increments. That was the finest temporal resolution for this historical weather set that we were using. So we were not able to look at a 15-minute averaging interval, despite the fact that 15 minutes is quite a common value in practice. So that's why we didn't look at it. There's no reason to not expect that these trends would continue. Mechanically, looking at why this is happening, I would fully expect the trends that we see here to be more pronounced for the 15-minute averaging interval than just a continuation of the trends that we're observing here. I think you could reasonably linearly extrapolate that.
Great. There is a question, what tool did you use to generate the different load profiles? You did touch upon that in the methods, but maybe give it a little bit more information on that.
Yeah, we used the Energy Plus simulation software, and actually, Naeem, I think you might know a little bit more about where to point people to get a hold of that.
Yeah, so we used actually this software to develop the load profiles for the last two projects as well, which were looking at both residential and commercial demand charges. The link to those building models, so Energy Plus is a load simulation software developed for the Department of Energy, and a number of models were developed for 19 different commercial building types. And then we ran that weather data, so it's a 30-minute weather data from the National Solar Resource Database through this Energy Plus model to develop these load profiles. We have a number of the load profiles are available on OpenEI. So OpenEI is an open data platform for energy data. And a number of them are available there for download. And again, they're simulated; they're not real data, but that's where they came from. Okay, so there is a question: why do primary schools have the best synergies for solar and storage?
Yeah, so a lot of that is the primary schools as well as secondary schools, I believe, to a somewhat lesser extent. They just have the best alignment of when they're consuming electricity and when PV is most productive. At least in the simulations that we have, they tend to peak. Their original building peaks with its energy consumption around midday. So the solar system is particularly effective at reducing the demand charges on buildings that have their energy consumption peak during the middle of the day. I would encourage everyone to as best as possible, try to interpret these not as specific building characteristics, but more as an indication of the performance of these systems for host buildings that have temporal patterns that are representative of that building type. So obviously a school that has a lot of energy consumption during the evening would not see this particular trend. As far as why there's a great deal of synergy between the two technologies, I don't have a figure or graphic to explain why it's particularly good for the primary school. I guess it's just that the best way to understand it is that the thing that we called synergy number one is most prominent for the original temporal consumption of the primary school in the simulations that we ran.
Good. So there's a question about whether the cooperation ratio varies based on the ratio of installed solar kilowatts to storage capacity. So, and is there kind of a solar to storage ratio that maximizes that cooperation ratio Did you look at that?
Yes, we have. I have a slide. So in the graphic that I showed when we were introducing the cooperation ratio, as a reminder, the solar and storage systems were sized to generate 20% of the host building's annual energy consumption, and 20% inverter capacity to be 20% of the building's lifetime peak demand, just as a reminder. However, what we have seen is that cooperation ratio tends to increase as the systems get larger. So this graphic right here is showing the histogram for cooperation ratio with increasing sizes. So you can see here, this corresponds to that green checkered map that I showed earlier in the presentation, but we see larger systems here having increasing cooperation ratios as the systems get larger. Now, this is a little bit tough to describe what's going on, and I have yet to really package this in a clean and intuitive way, but it's best to think about this as large systems essentially have a high synergy for co-deployment because of the fact that each individual technology alone has those diminishing returns that we had previously talked about. And when you co-deploy them, they are kind of mitigating the diminishment of those returns. So it's best to think about it as larger systems acting alone get more and more inefficient, and co-deploying them will make them less inefficient with larger. However, it's not like you're discovering new value in the sense that a small solar plus storage system in terms of like kilowatts of billing demand reduction per the metric to describe the size of the system per kilowatt of capacity installed will always be greater for smaller systems than for larger systems. It's just, again, we see these diminishing returns. Small systems are always going to be more efficient at reducing billing demand. There's other things going on when we talk about the financial performance, like economies of scale, that might make it so ultimately the financial performance is dictated essentially by a trade-off of those two. Larger systems are cheaper on a per kilowatt basis. However, smaller systems are more productive on a per kilowatt basis. And that's kind of the optimization question that you might want to get at if you're designing a system. But since we didn't look at the financial here, we're just looking at the trends, which is illustrated by both the diminishing return plots that I showed in the briefing and illustrated by the plots that I'm showing you right now, where we can see the cooperation ratio increasing as system sizes increase.
Great. So there is a question here, just kind of a clarification question on how what you mean by round-trip efficiency of the battery. You had presented early on, I think it was 83% round-trip efficiency. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, that's essentially, it's including the losses both internal to the battery as well as passing through the inverter to convert it from the DC to AC in both directions. So it's basically if you put 100 kilowatt hours into the battery, you would then, when you're extracting them, only get 83 kilowatt hours out. That is simply one representative number. There's a lot of systems that perform both better and worse than that, plus that the efficiency is a function of the way that the battery is behaving and other things like the temperature of the battery and its surroundings, its environment. So certainly that is a simplification to just treat that as one constant number. But again, for the broad trends that we're showing here, they simply were not sensitive to it. So I guess I wouldn't get hung up on it, although if you're sizing a system for your own financial performance, then you should definitely pay a lot more attention to that number than we did here.
Right. So someone is asking whether we assume that the battery storage is able to charge both from the grid or from the solar system, or only the solar system.
Yeah, we allowed it to charge from both. It was indifferent to it. We also, to clarify, did not assume that they were, I'm forgetting the term, is it tightly coupled, where the PV system could charge the battery directly from DC energy without passing through the inverter. We did not explore that in this analysis. So we just let the battery operate independently, charging off of AC, and it was indifferent to whether or not that was coming from the PV system or the grid.
So one of our last questions at least, a forward-looking question, which is, as utilities are adjusting rate structures to combat the duck curve, how would you forecast these synergies to reflect this change? So I think that the person is probably talking about perhaps if there are time of use rates where the peak times are later in the afternoon, how would these synergies reflect the change?
Yeah, I guess I'm going to interpret it perhaps slightly different than it's phrased, and just say that I think there needs to be some honest examination of whether or not demand charges are effective and efficient and accurate price signals to communicate the value that these technologies are providing to the grid, especially exemplified by situations like the duck curve, where it is reasonable to look at the essentially the savings that a solar plus storage system can achieve through demand charge reduction, and see how it's not necessarily indicating to that system how to most effectively use its capacity, which would be, in the example of a duck curve, to discharge during the evening when the system is peaking. It instead would be discharging when the host building is peaking, which might be, in the worst circumstances, it could be during the middle of the day, when you might be actually curtailing PV and you don't need any more electricity. And then if the building happens to be not peaking during the evening, it would have essentially a financial motivation to then charge up its battery in the early evening hours, which is potentially when the duck curve is peaking, and now you're adding additional load to that. So there needs to be better analysis of essentially what demand charge designs most effectively align the value that is being communicated to the behind-the-meter customers, and how to operate their storage assets to be aligned with what's beneficial for the broader system. I think that's like the next natural step.
Excellent. We have 2 minutes left and more questions that we can answer, and we will try and kind of follow up with individual questions that we weren't able to answer. But a very quick one, was there a specific demand rate used in the analysis, and if so, was that specific to each city, or was it just the geographic variability that was used to model weather variability?
Yeah, we didn't have when you say demand rate, I'm interpreting that as like a dollar per kilowatt rate, like $10 per kilowatt. We didn't assume any value like that throughout any point in time here. So we don't ever talk about dollar values. We just talk about billing demand reduction. And part of that is that this is the most general way to report the results. You can then interpret them in light of your own unique situation by kind of projecting these onto the demand charge rate in your service territory, or the tariff that you're considering. But because those vary so significantly across service territories, we decided it was more general to simply report the results in terms of building demand reduction, not making an assumption about demand charge rates.
Excellent. And that is now 10 a.m. Pacific time, 1 p.m. Eastern. I'd like to thank Peter for the webinar presentation, as well as everyone for joining us. Again, the webinar has been recorded and will be available on the YouTube channel that we have, that I've shared in the chat box earlier, and it'll probably be up online tomorrow. Thanks again, and have a great rest of your day.